Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Better Futures Forum Day 2. You are in the transport session where we will be examining and plotting a better transport future for Australia. My name is Alexi Lynch, and I will be your host today. I'm the business manager at Ironbark Sustainability and also one of the BFA Local Council Working Group co-conveners alongside Kathy Oak, Stephanie Zeech, and Darcy Pimblett, and it's a pleasure to be here today and part of this session. We've got Stephanie here as well in the virtual room doing a bit of moderating for the discussion, and also Emily Bennett from JT Productions. I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the people of the Kulin Nation, the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, and I would like to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to encourage everyone to use the chat feature located in the right-hand side of your screen. We encourage you to share your own research, links or thoughts on the session topics. And this is one where there's a lot of news and a lot of recent bits and pieces coming through. When we come to our virtual Q&A, you can either write your question in the question box or you can raise your hand and we will bring you into the session with video and audio when appropriate. Please don't write your questions into the chat feature. If you need to contact our events team or tech support, then navigate to your inbox at the top of your screen and search event support for instant chat. We'd also like to get an indication of where you're from. So we do have a quick poll. Jump on please so we know who you are while we introduce this session. The transport revolution has begun. The next decade will be critical to ensure that our communities are ready for the changes and the opportunities abound. Looking at council's community or municipal-wide local government emissions profiles across Australia, we see that council emissions are as varied as the communities that they are part of. And there's a link in the chat box there so you can check out your own proportion of emissions. Many regional and rural councils have large proportion of agricultural emissions, not so for most metro councils. Some councils have a fair amount of gas, others have none. And most council areas in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, NT and WA have significant emissions from electricity. In Tassie and South Australia, where there is a higher percentage of renewable energy within the grid, electricity emissions are lower and falling. There is one sector where almost every council will have between 15 and 30% of emissions from transport. All councils have cars, trucks, buses, heavy vehicles within and across municipal boundaries. So the challenge is to reduce the 15 to 30% of emissions in this sector to zero in the next decade or so. This is where councils can look to interventions in the community, such as helping facilitate charging infrastructure, adjustments to strategic and statutory planning, developing walking, pedestrian strategies, education around barriers such as range anxiety and advocacy with other sectors. Of course, it's a much bigger conversation than just switching to electric vehicles. Travel will be different, work patterns different, technology different. The planning and thinking needs to start immediately. Local governments need to work with other key stakeholders to make sure that we are prepared. So we've brought the transport stakeholders and experts here. We're going to address the bigger questions for councils navigating this complex area. How do we best plan a charging infrastructure? How do we turn this into commercial, or how do we turn things commercial and livability opportunities to invigorate local shopping strips or cafes? How will travel be different in 10 to 15 years' time? And what are the levers that local governments can use? We have 5 incredible guests today: Petra, Rob Law, Alice Woodruff, Claire Painter, and Helen Rowe. We're going to get some introductory remarks from each of them and then bring everyone together to discuss and answer these big questions. Keep the comments coming in the chat, the questions in the question box, and I will now welcome our first speaker. First, we have Petra Stock from the Australian Conservation Foundation, and many of you hopefully heard her in the plenary session just before and giving us that incredible introduction. Petra is an expert in climate, energy and transport solutions, 2 decades of experience working on complex programs and policies in state and local government, the private and not-for-profit sectors. She's a qualified environmental engineer, capable of understanding scientific and technical issues, and is a skilled communicator, able to convey complex concepts in plain English. And she's also studying a Master of Journalism, and you can find a lot of her articles online as we speak. She's led the Energy and Climate Solutions Strategy and Policy and Research at the Climate Council at ClimateWorks, currently at ACF. Petra, you've set the scene. And in this session, we're going to, of course, touch on electric vehicles and infrastructure, but we want to look much broader than that, as you pointed out. This breakout session is already very different to how it was planned, given that when we planned this a few months ago, there have been announcements from Victoria and New South Wales state governments in the last few months, maybe something from the feds, I don't know. It's a little hard to keep up with the change. So how are we going in Australia in relation to reducing emissions from transport sector and creating a better transport future?
Hi, and I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri land, where I'm very lucky to live with access to lots of beautiful local green spaces, especially as we find ourselves in lockdown for the 6th time here in Melbourne. Work in climate policy at ACF. And I used to work in planning and environmental approvals for major energy and transport infrastructure projects. So I guess this is an area that I've been interested in for a long time. And probably anyone who knows me from the climate space will know that transport solutions to climate change is my real absolute passion. And certainly in Australia, we urgently need solutions. Transport is one of our largest emission sources. Before COVID-19, and we'll get to that, the sector was one of the fastest growing sources of emissions. On pretty much any measure, we're one of the least sustainable and worst polluting in the world. We have one of the most emissions intensive road vehicle fleets. We did have one of the world's highest per capita air emissions. And we have very low shares of travel by public transport, cycling and walking compared to countries. But obviously everything's changed in the past year or so, 18 months or so. And I think that COVID-19 should be a huge opportunity for a real rethink on transport. We're all doing everything differently now, and that provides a great opportunity to really step back and think about what are the transport systems that we want that not only reduce emissions, can help stimulate the economy, which will be needed in response to the coronavirus, and also help us have better, cleaner, healthier, happier communities. That's, I think, why transport is such an exciting solution to climate change, because the solutions to transport also can help us have a more equitable society, healthier cities, can create jobs, all those good things. There's almost no downside. So just a bit of a broad brush. When I talk about transport solutions, I mean reducing the use of private cars, electrifying vehicles of all types, not just cars, but trams, trains, buses, and micro mobility, maximising the use of public transport and travel. And I know we've got some real experts in those areas here today. And also building into our longer term transport and infrastructure plans into the major projects that we're deciding every year, making sure all of those things we're deciding now are consistent with achieving zero emissions transport in the future. And I would say this is not just my take. This is what the World Resources Institute says, C40, and the IEA. I think, for example, many of you will have heard about the IEA's Net Zero by 2050 report that came out. And we've heard a lot about the oil and gas and coal information within that report. But in there also is that for large cities by 2030, we need to be phasing out private car trips. This is according to the IEA. We need to phase out internal combustion engine cars. we need a 20 to 50% shift from car trips to buses. And we need to replace the remainder of trips by walking, cycling and other public transport. And also have no growth in flights and replace flights with teleworking and rail. So that's what the IEA says, and that definitely reflects what needs to happen in transport. But there's a huge opportunity, and lots of countries are already moving on this issue. We know that 17 countries have plans to ban the sale of fossil fuel vehicles. We know that countries like Australia, but not Australia yet, are setting targets for electric vehicles. For example, the UK is hoping to have 50 to 70% of new vehicle sales being electric by 2030. And cities all over the world are committing to only buy zero emissions buses, including London, Los Angeles, Austin, Auckland, Moscow. And lots of governments like the UK and New Zealand have really looked to stimulate their economies in response to COVID by investing in public and active transport. So we do have this huge opportunity, and which we're talking about today, and local governments have a really enormous role to play. They're responsible for land use planning, they provide facilities and infrastructure, support active travel, public transport and vehicle sharing, and are already leading on transport. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Petra, for setting the scene. There's a lot to unpack there. I would now like to introduce Rob Law. Rob has an extensive background in developing and delivering regional climate programs, advocacy and policy development. He's been at the Central Victorian Greenhouse Alliance for 4 years, and before then worked at, I think, every other alliance that there is. Rob, you've been working on the ground through greenhouse alliances, regional groups of councils over the last decade. You've worked with inner city councils, and now you are in Central Victoria. Tell us about the experience of councils on the Charging the Regions project. How do we build on this?
Great, thanks Lex, and thanks for having me everybody. I'm dialing in from Jara country, with lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung in Central Victoria. And yeah, it's great to be here. I think Petra gave a really good overview of the whole systems thinking that we need to think about with transport planning. I've worked for a long time with councils on climate solutions, and I think councils have a really great suite of options in terms of how they can both sort out their own operations as leaders, but also influence what happens in the community. And as Lex and Petra's pointed out, this is a much bigger conversation than electric vehicles, and it's important that we talk about electric vehicles, but it's not the only thing. And I think for me, it's a challenging time to talk about the silver linings of COVID, because a lot of us are in lockdown, and I think it's I don't want to sort of talk it up too much about what the benefits have been, but I do think that a lot of us have commented on the things that we've noticed through being able to live more locally and what's come out of that. And I think in the context of transport planning, what's really important is framing it around what makes us happier and healthier, rather than focusing so much on reducing emissions or adapting to climate change. These are sort of co-benefits, I suppose. If we look at what makes us happier and healthier, then if you look at the detail of those solutions, then it often leads to lower emissions and more adaptive to climate change. So I think it's a good time to be talking about this. It's a really exciting opportunity to rethink completely how we move ourselves around and how we move our goods around. I think there's been a lot of good comments in the chat I've seen about the fact that there's much less noise pollution at the moment, and that's just one sort of benefit. People sort of hearing birds that they never used to hear. They're sort of get out on the street meeting neighbours they never met before. So they're building social connections. They're building more connections to their local place. They're noticing that they might have not very good walking tracks around where they live, and all of a sudden they're demanding that from councils. So we're seeing all of these flow-on effects, and all of a sudden our priority that we've given to cars over the last 3 or 4 decades is starting to shift, which is a great thing. And I think that's the challenge: is how do we get ourselves thinking about what makes us happier and healthier. So I'm happy to talk a bit more about some of our projects a bit later on, maybe Charging the Regions, which is focused more about delivering public charging infrastructure in regional Victoria. But I'll leave it at that for now.
feel free to chuck in any info background into the chat as well to share with other people. We're now going to hear from Alice Woodruff. Alice is the Director of Active City, a practice which develops strategies that encourage people to use sustainable travel options to specific destinations, precincts, or at a city scale. Alice, 20 years of working on travel planning, walking strategies, travel smart programs, helping businesses, state governments and local governments. What is a better transport future? Where do we want to be in 2030?
Thanks, Lex. It's great to be part of this panel, and I think I'm echoing some sentiments from Petra and Rob, but where do we want to be in 2030? My optimistic self says that 10 years from now, we're well on the path to rapidly reducing our use and ownership of private vehicles for our travel. And the proportion of car travel is shrinking rapidly, and the number of cars per household is also dropping. Electric vehicles are a really vital part of our transition to zero emissions, but we know they're still the most energy intensive, space intensive, and the least healthy travel option for us to get around. So given that we've also got rapidly growing populations in our cities and towns, we need to shift away from private car travel. And it's good to have the global organisations really confirming this, as Petra outlined. In 2030, I see walking, bike riding and other micro-mobilities are the first options for our local trips. And that's not just in our inner cities, but all our neighbourhoods and other areas. Because by then, they're safe, they're convenient, they're really enjoyable, we like doing them, and they have priority over car access. So some examples that by 2030, we've got rid of minimum parking provisions in our planning schemes. We have safer 30k speed limits in our neighbourhoods, which encourage people to walk and ride. Schools have car-free catchments. Major destinations like shopping centres and other big workplaces have facilities and services so that their employees and customers prefer to get there by sustainable travel options. Public transport, that's a no-brainer. It's frequent and reliable, so it's a real option. And I think importantly, technologies like e-bikes and scooters have helped shift away from longer distance car trips as they shrink the distances in our lower density suburbs, so that riding to the station and catching the train is an easier and cheaper option than driving and paying a congestion tax or whatever other pricing mechanisms in place in 2030. The rest of my pitch for 10 years from now, we should be 8 years into delivering a zero emissions transport strategy that's led by state government in partnership with local government, because that's where the change is occurring. We have the right regulations and price signals in place to reduce our car ownership and use. We have federal funding, not only for roads and public transport, but also for walking and bike riding projects. And importantly, since I'm into behaviour change, sustainable transport in all its forms has become our social norm for how we get around. I'm looking forward to more of a conversation. Thanks, Lex.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alice. We're now going to hear from Claire Petra, who is the Head of Business Development at JetCharge, that designs, distributes, installs and manages electric vehicle charging solutions nationwide. Before she was at JetCharge, Claire was at Mercedes-Benz, leading the mobility with a focus on readying the Australian and New Zealand markets for electric vehicles. Claire, you've worked in climate policy, state government, think tanks, and most recently one very well-known large global automobile company. You're now at JetCharge, Australia's leading or largest EV charging infrastructure company. Presumably this is a boom area and everybody in Australia is knocking on your door as we prepare for this near future.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining today. And forgive me, I'm 3 weeks into this new role, having started a new job while dealing with COVID. Doing remote inductions and stuff is tricky. And I think the really interesting thing for me in starting in this new role is people are still knocking on JetCharge's door, even with COVID. We've got more inquiries than we know what to do with. So it shows that regardless of the current situation that we are in, the transition is happening, which is really comforting to know, I think. So in terms of JetCharge, just a bit of background. JetCharge is often referred to as one of Australia's leading charging installers. To give you a bit of an idea of scale and what we do, JetCharge has been around for almost a decade now, which is surprising given that I think a lot of people are only just starting to think about charging and the challenges that it can present in terms of transitioning to zero emission vehicles, electric vehicles. So for JetCharge, we do about 400 commercial sites, so installations at 400 commercial sites a year. In terms of home charging, we're doing between 8 and 20 a week, which is huge. And we partner with all the OEMs in Australia. And in terms of total installations, we've done more than 6,000 now. So we have huge scale in terms of what we're trying to do at JetCharge. And I suppose we're often referred to as Australia's largest charging installer, but we're actually in a transition phase where we're moving from being a hardware supplier and installer to being, I suppose, a true turnkey solution for charging. Our aim now is to work with everyone from local councils, state and federal government, through to energy retailers, working with all the OEMs and coming up with a solution that best fits their needs. And we're doing this through the use of technology. So how can we leverage? It's not just about a particular piece of hardware and going into someone's house and putting it on the wall for them. It's about education, and it's about giving them that holistic picture on how to manage their charging in the most sustainable way. So that's kind of what we're doing at JetCharge. And I think there's some really interesting things in terms of what councils can be doing to support its constituents with the transition to more sustainable transport. And a lot of the speakers just in their intro this morning have talked about, you know, we've seen a shift in the way people are moving about in COVID, and it is really interesting. People are walking more. Public transport has dropped off a little bit. And the interesting thing is private vehicle use has increased. People are looking at buying a car to get around. So how do we educate people to make the best decision when they're looking at that? The reality is if you buy an internal combustion engine vehicle now, you might only have it for 3 or 4, 5 years, but it will be in the system for up to 18, 20 years. So it's the decisions that we're making now which have an impact on how things will be handled in the future. So for councils, there's lots of different things you can do to support your constituents, and I'm sure we'll get to all these questions, but even just basic things like transitioning your own fleet, being that source of education for the people in your area, being a visual point of reference so that people in your area know that you're transitioning to electric vehicles. And I suppose it provides that level of certainty for them that this is a sustainable and a smart option. And then also just education in general. I think there's a big part that local councils can play to support in that process. Thanks, Lexi. I'll pass back to you.
So much, Claire. We've got one intro to go. Just a reminder to chuck your questions in the question area and the chat in the chat area, because then we can actually see all the questions, and we can also, I think you can even rank them and like them if you like. So we've got a lot there. So I'm going to just smash through some of these intros so we can get through to them. Like to introduce our final speaker, Helen Rowe. Helen leads ClimateWorks transport program, working with government and industry stakeholders to define a common vision and action plan to move the transport sector to zero emissions. Perfect for this presentation. Helen, ClimateWorks have a rapidly growing team and a pretty big focus on transport. I saw your recent report showing that transport emissions are the fastest growing source of emissions in Australia, rising mainly due to population and domestic product growth, but the sector offers one of the most profitable emissions reduction opportunities. I understand you're planning on partnering with local government, engaging with major stakeholders, and developing state of play and pathway publications. Where are we at?
Thanks, Alexi. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everybody. And hi, I'm joining everyone from Wonderyland, also in lockdown, as many of the speakers are. Thanks for the introduction. And yes, ClimateWorks has been, I guess, growing its ambition around transport, particularly recognising that the transport sector is a fair bit behind, I guess, in terms of this overall emissions reduction task we have ahead of us. And as you mentioned, it is rapidly growing, as a number of other speakers have mentioned. And it's actually set to be one of the largest emitters. So if we think about some of those other groups like the stationary energy and other big emitting areas, they're actually tracking down. So just to think forward, if you have responsibility for transport in your organisation, in the next 5 years, that may be, in the media as the highest emitter. So just to think through ahead of that, to think about, that's going to be pretty exposed, as I guess. So these solutions are not only needed, but, it's going to be a fair bit of a risk area in the next 5 years. So as you mentioned, ClimateWorks does a lot of work around, I guess, building a sort of really solid evidence base for everybody. And last year we released the Moving to Zero report. I just popped a link in the chat for that report to really set the pathway for Australia on its emissions reduction around transport. But I guess this is just a starting point for us. So that was sort of pulling together what was known already and trying to pull together all the literature for everyone as a starting that evidence base. And now we've just grown into a bigger transport team, and we're looking at now how do we help people to make the change happen on the ground. So transitioning that evidence to action. So obviously there's some work, EVs that keeps coming up here as obviously a big part of that, but only one part of the transport system. So we're really looking at a key leverage point for that is going to be those national settings, and you're seeing successful countries around the world putting in ambitious targets, putting in vehicle emission standards, putting in banning targets to ban internal combustion engines. So that's really going to be a big part of that. We're looking at what the right mix of incentives are, and I think local government can play a role there to look at who might be missing out in your communities in terms of the EV transition and some of that equity issues as well in that future. I think we're talking about the 2030 timeline, but I guess I'm also thinking about the 2050, the actual, net zero, and thinking about the future technology transitions as well. So just to keep in mind for long-term planning is also this idea of there's other ideas about mobility as a service and autonomous vehicles and how they're going to come in as disruptors. So we could start really focusing on EVs, but in the meantime, we could transition to autonomous vehicles, and there's a push for every household, and this is like the horror scenario, I guess every household has 5 EV autonomous vehicles for every member of the family. We know that's going to cause our cities to go into meltdown. So, thinking through that, how we bring those technologies into a zero emission pathway is really important. So I guess I'll wrap up here. I'm really interested in the conversation, but we're really eager to partner with local governments in this, knowing that they kind of own cities on the ground and see how these issues, I guess, are really lived by people. So we're really interested in that conversation. And I guess just broadly, something I'm really interested in, I've got a long transport background, is really thinking about what is a good transport system for our cities and thinking about how we align that to net zero, rather than just, I guess, putting all our eggs in the one basket of EVs and really having that broad vision, knowing that EVs play a role, but thinking about what we want our cities to look like and working back from that vision, maybe Alice's vision, which sounded pretty lovely, and working towards that rather than thinking about letting the technology, I guess, lead us down a certain path around being in power of that transition. I think I'd love to see that. I'd love to see what questions the audience have in that regard.
Great. Thank you, Helen. Perfect segue to, we've got the opportunity to ask questions to the speakers. I'd like to now invite all the speakers back to the screen, and the most popular question as well, which was the first one we had anyway, around what a council does. We've touched on maybe what you do if you're a big inner city council, but what about smaller regional councils? And so as Christine Rogers has put it, the conversation has been mainly around larger cities. So not using private cars is a big challenge in smaller regional towns. What are the suggestions for these towns? How do we make sure that we're not left behind? If we could start with Alice and then Helen.
It's a really vital question. We're not all living in inner city Melbourne. There's a large portion of Australia's population in regional towns and centres. I'd break it into two parts because there's the inter-regional town travel, but I think it's important to recognise that within those regional towns, you are still working in local neighbourhoods and local settings. So there's still an opportunity to support a growth in walking and bike riding and other micro-mobilities, which are often not used. I spend quite a bit of time living in Ocean Grove on the Bellarine, and it's not really remote, but the culture there is that it's so convenient to drive. That's what everyone does. So part of a shift is making those local neighbourhood trips that are occurring in cities as well as in towns as appealing by walking, bike riding and other micro-mobilities. But it is really critical to look at those longer distance trips because we are a dispersed population, and that is where new technology, EVs and good public transport links are a key part of that. I'm happy, maybe Helen or Claire might want to speak to that as well.
Yeah, great, Alice. Yeah, I'd just build on that, echo the same kind of points, but also think about, I mean, you know, it's where you think about what's the right solution for the right location and think about what the types of trips are people are making and what that would look like. So, you know, in dispersed areas where you are going to be reliant on a car, like we've been thinking about, you know, which areas really do need to transition first to EVs. And one of the things in that is thinking about who drives the furthest. So who's generating the most emissions? So, you know, I think regional areas are one area where we could be looking better at the transition to EVs happening there faster, looking at which models of vehicles are needed in these areas and thinking about how we collectively, as a government, we know that we're missing some of those really high-level settings at the national level to get new models coming into Australia, but how can we find other levels of local government or state government leadership to really, I guess, get on the front foot to finding out what models of vehicles do we need to come in? And I think maybe echoing the point that Claire made about that, you know, providing certainty and visibility about education. Like, I'll just give a great example. I was in pre-COVID world when I was traveling. I was in Vancouver, and the city of North Vancouver had outside their council offices, they had a rack. This is going to sound like a silly example, but I was pretty excited about it. They had a rack for putting your bike on a bus. I don't know if anyone's ever seen them around. I know Canberra had them for a while, but I remember seeing them around in Melbourne and thinking, it looks terrifying. This is kind of like funny rack and you have to put your bike on it. And I thought, I don't want to be holding up a bus trying to work out how I put my bike on the front. Just looked like a good idea, but actually terrifying. And a lot of those trials kind of failed. But I thought, you know, that kind of role, what a clever idea to let people kind of try it out in a stationary way to test that out, to overcome their fears about how that's going to work. So I think there's some really good roles local government can play. Again, Claire might want to jump in here, but that idea of like visibility and giving people a chance to think through the barriers they may have at the local level and help them with that education. And, you know, having a charging station outside council, we can just practice plugging it in so you know that it's not going to be too hard, that kind of stuff. So, yeah, Claire might have a few extra points.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And Alice, Helen, completely agree with you. And I think you're right. I often come to this stuff from an EV perspective, given my background, but there are a whole range of solutions that cover alternative transport beyond vehicle use, you know, active transport, bikes, all this kind of stuff that councils can be doing. From the EV perspective, I think a really important step is transitioning council fleet to electric vehicles. Even if it's just a few, if you think about the way your fleet is used in your council, you have people that will jump into that to go to meetings that are a little bit further away. And it's getting people that exposure to that type of technology. And if you drive an electric vehicle, you go, okay, this isn't as scary as I thought it would be. And then you go home and you tell your family and friends and you're like, I drove an EV today, and you start disseminating the information that way. And I think there's real value in that. You know, local councils are a trusted source of information, but if you look at how people make decisions about new technology, they go to their family and friends to validate what they're thinking. And so giving people that opportunity to be exposed to the technology, and in a non-threatening way, if you've got a fleet manager who can sit in the car with you, show you how to use it before you go off on a drive, that's a really perfect way just to ease people into it. And then on top of that, if you've got your electric vehicles, stick it up and they're driving through your local community, other people can see them. And then same thing, having a charger out the front of your council buildings, have people so that they can come in and ask questions. All this stuff is just really easy ways to start bringing the conversation into the community.
Rob, I might pass to you if that's okay now, given you've got the experience on the ground, worked with dozens of councils of all shapes and sizes. You've heard from that, especially in, say, regional areas or towns. Will this have traction?
Yeah, I was hoping to jump in just because I live in a small regional town, and I've been thinking about this a lot. The differences, I suppose, being formerly in a metro area where I could cycle between most of our council members, and now having to drive sort of 5 hours to a half an hour councillor briefing. It's a very different setting, and a lot of people in regional towns, often live on the outskirts of the town, so it's quite a challenge just to be promoting sort of cycling and walking. But I do think it's the challenge is having as many different diversity of options for the diversity of people that live in the community. There's a lot of different trends. There's a lot of people moving out of cities into regional areas at the moment, which is changing the dynamics of things. There's a lot of old people that the demographics of regional towns particularly have a lot of old people. And I noticed the comment from someone about Darwin, and I think I used to live in Darwin as well, so I used to think a lot about Darwin and places like Castlemaine, where I live now, and Darwin both get extremely hot. And you really start to notice when you're walking through, just where the shade is. And so projects like Bendigo's got a project called Shadeways, which is sort of mapping the pedestrian routes in the city that you can sort of get from A to B through enough canopy cover. So sort of bringing different elements of what council does together. So, all the urban forest planners and the transport planners, and really enhancing all of the assets we have around cycling and walking, so it becomes something that people want to do. But it's also not losing sight of the fact that we don't want to be too ableist in our thinking. There's a lot of old people that can't get on a bike necessarily, and so what are the diversity of options that we need? I think I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic, thanks, Rob. A few weeks ago, the Feds announced that winning bidders for the first round of Commonwealth grants through ARENA to boost the rollout of fast charging stations. 5 recipients of the first round of the $25 million under the Future Funds, aimed at increasing charging infrastructure in the hope of driving greater uptake of electric vehicles. Is this a sign of the right direction, Petra?
Just repeat that.
Yeah, sure. So the Feds have announced the winning bidders for the rollout of fast charging stations. So hoping for greater uptake of electric vehicles. Is this a sign in the right direction? And I guess another way to put it is, what other form of support is needed at the federal level to support decarbonisation of transports in our cities and regions?
Well, obviously, having access to charging infrastructure is really important, but there's a lot else that the federal government could be doing. One key thing the federal government plays a role in is in, Infrastructure Australia sets sort of priorities for infrastructure, decides on kind of its priority projects, and it would be great to see them embedding plans to get to zero emissions in transport into that sort of thinking. So, because obviously everything we build today is going to be around in 2050, and actually we need to get to zero emissions much earlier. So we really need basically everything we do from this moment on to be consistent with that vision. So infrastructure planning is something really important the Feds could do. Also, they play a huge role in setting targets, although states can do that too and are stepping in and doing that now as well. I think it would be great to see the federal government setting an electric vehicle target to bring Australia in line with what other countries are doing. And we've said those things. They had a consultation on their future fuels strategy earlier in the year, and we haven't seen the results of that yet. And also helping to fund some of these great projects, like Alice said, instead of continually funding roads, which sort of exacerbate some of the problems that we have, putting more federal money into the solutions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Petra. Alice, I might go back to you if that's okay. We often hear about we've heard that COVID changes everything, the way we work, live, eat, drink, play, and will have permanent impacts. Many of us might not need to head into the office again, and instead of having a coffee lunch in the CBDs, it's local cafes and economies and further decentralisation. There's a wonderful visual from Alison Lee from Urbis. I hope I pronounced that correctly, and I've put in chat doing the rounds a few weeks ago, looking at the economic benefits of dining, parklets, bike parking, and car parking. Is there support from the feds that you think we would need to look broadly at decarbonisation of the transport sector? What would be your big asks?
Whew. Well, I guess more money for walking and bike riding projects. There are many aspects, and probably I think that the policy leads here, Helen and Petra could jump into that. But I guess I'm looking at it from a local level, and coming back to Rob's intro point about what are the things that make our communities happy, economically vibrant, and socially good places to be in. And that is where Alison Lee's description of, you know, the potential value of one individual car space, how much money does local government gain from that? The lowest option is parking revenue. The better options are bike parking, where many people park there and then are spending time in that community. We do need actions that invigorate our local centres, with people having this new hybrid work life where we're more often at home and only sometimes in a future office post lockdown number. Let's not put in the number, because hopefully lockdown number 6 is the final one. But the hybrid way of working is that we will continue to be living more locally, and so local government and the funding to support that are centres, local neighbourhood centres that are walkable, comfortable, with street trees for shade, with enough space and safe travel speeds to encourage people to move around locally by walking, bike riding, and other micro-mobilities which do stretch the potential for young and elderly to use and move around in that way. So there's so many things that local government can lead on if there's additional federal funding to support those actions. I think we're running short of time, so I think someone else should jump in and pitch their case.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just jump in with my 2 cents worth, my dream list. I think I just probably really strongly echo the point Petra made about infrastructure and also just decision-making frameworks. I guess it's easy to think about it's really important to think about the stuff on the ground, but really the big bucks and the big decision-making happens in transport, about how investment happens generally. And I guess there's kind of a lot of biases in that system to think about cars, and not from some, part of it's just how we've always done things. We're good at building roads. We keep the things that we collect in terms of data are about how we build roads. So just thinking about, how do we weigh up our investment, whether it's, how do we better weigh up a big bit of infrastructure versus investment in buses, which we know gets into all of our neighbourhoods and into our communities in the outer areas that probably maybe need it, versus a big bit of infrastructure. How do we get better at weighing them up and integrating carbon emissions into that decision-making process, knowing that infrastructure actually embeds a lot of behaviours which are a little bit hidden from our thinking. So I think that big infrastructure and decision-making processes to better, I guess, balance transport and emissions and get better outcomes for our communities.
Great, thanks, Helen. We are smashing through this in low on time, so I'm going to race around and ask you guys just for a couple of a quick response to a final question that's come up, and it's been a very popular one, and councils often ask this, taking it back to the local government level and our understanding of what we can control versus what we can influence as a sector. What's the role of local government in influencing those changes in state and federal policy settings? So specifically around the advocacy, I guess, how do we best advocate when we as a local government sector, or the sectors that you're talking to, don't actually control those levers? Petra, I'll start with you and then Rob.
I just wanted to talk about money because, interestingly, one of the biggest fossil fuel subsidies we have in Australia is the fuel tax rebate. And it's a transport one, and Australia has signed up in multiple forums to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. So why don't we use that enormous pool of money, which is around $7 billion, according to the Australia Institute? Why don't we use that for sustainable transport? Maybe local governments can advocate to have a slice of that.
Awesome. Rob?
Okay, big question. I think generally, we like the idea that councils can, be the best advocates through leadership and showcasing how to do things really well. And there's going to be limits to what councils can do in this space. So I think it's sort of like a nested approach. Councils need to hear from the communities that communities want to be spending less than at the moment 30-40% of council budgets go to roads, and imagine what we could do if we reprioritise some of that. And if councils started to hear that from the community, then they can then also start to advocate that up the chain as well. And I think they can have greater impact in their advocacy the more they work together. And that's sort of what we try to coordinate, is that collaboration and getting councils to sort of be on the same page about what the asks are of state and federal policy, like the example that Petra made.
Claire, how do local governments best advocate for things that are outside of their control?
Yeah, and I think, Rob, you make a really good point around a coordinated approach and a coordinated or a centralised voice for local councils. I think the thing that's missing in transport policy in general in Australia at the moment is lack of coordination. Where we've seen some really good state policies come out in the last couple of months. Federal government's done the Future Fuels Fund, but there's no oversight on how to pull that all together. And I think that's the thing that's really missing in terms of getting some real traction on transport policy. It's a real kind of piecemeal approach at the moment. I think that's what's really key. And I think local governments having a voice in that process is really important, because at the end of the day, it's the communities which are the ones that are transitioning into these new areas of transport, the ones that might be switching to an electric vehicle or hydrogen or whatever it might be. And I think it's understanding those needs and making sure that any big policy decisions that are being made are being reflected by the community's needs.
Alice and Helen, and are there existing channels that we as a sector, as local government sector, can join into for that sort of advocacy?
Look, very briefly, I'm just looking at it from how we move around locally. So local councils can be leaders and show what it's like to open up streets to people walking and bike riding on their local streets as advocates for changes on state managed roads, as just one small example of the leadership they can take to shift bigger levels of change that need to be led by state government.
I echo all the points that the previous speakers have said around the testing things out on the ground and showcasing. But just taking off the point of collective leadership, I think there's that, that's on my to-do list actually, so I've just written that down of that's part of, I guess, ClimateWorks' role, or what we're looking at is some of that work around having that shared vision of what a zero emissions transit system looks like. But I guess maybe I'm just thinking tactically, and I'm really just, this idea just popped into my head, is getting that work together to really know what your ask is, and knowing that we're going to be two things. We're going to be in a tight budget conditions post-COVID, so we're going to have to do this stuff even at other levels of government, and we're going to be doing this stuff with not much money. So thinking about things that we could do that are things like, at the moment it can be really hard to do bike lanes because we don't have the design standards to do them. So some of that stuff is more having the standards to get things done rather than actually having the money to do things. So some of those sort of things. And I guess maybe just again, just thinking tactically about, we're going to see, I think, just reading the writing on the wall, we're going to see a transition from a federal fuel excise tax to probably a state-based road user charging and congestion charging, both from filling that funding hole, but also from a demand management point of view, when we have cheaper vehicles on the road, making sure we're not having extra congestion. So that's potentially going to mean there's going to be funding coming out of state government, which is a little bit closer to local government. So I guess just thinking forward to that transition and thinking through getting your ducks lined up to think about what your ask is and what you want transport to look like at the ground level, and thinking about tactical, low-cost things we can do that are going to fit into our COVID budgets. But really, that's just an idea that popped into my head then. But thinking through what's coming up in the next few years.
Thank you, Helen. That's awesome. We've run out of time, and there are so many questions there left. I think we'll have to talk to the Better Futures Australia people, and maybe we need a Better Futures Transport Day, because there's an extraordinary amount of questions and comments there, and I'm not sure, Emily and the crew from JT Productions, whether we can keep the comments and the discussions open, or whether we can even just capture those questions that we've got and even try and follow up afterwards. If everybody who's on the panel is happy, I can send them round from the people, or we can try and find a way to put them out there or look at a follow-up session, because there's just so much there to unpack. Thank you for joining this session and for all the questions and the comments. Delegates now have the opportunity to take a short break. You can join us back online at 12 o'clock. Thank you so much, Helen, Claire, Alice, Petra, and Rob, and also to Emily in the background and Steph in the background as well, and the other co-conveners of this working group, Darcy and Kathy, and Lisa Cliff, who's in the background of everything from Canna, putting all this together. Just going to give a quick plug to one of the sessions tomorrow, especially for all those local government people out there. Cities Race to Zero is at 12:30 tomorrow. This session together some of the big guns to demonstrate Australian local government contributions to achieving the Paris Agreement and the sort of actions that cities and towns throughout Australia can take ahead of COP. So come and have a listen and get involved with that, just as we've got involved in this one. Really appreciate it. Catch you at the next one, and thanks again to the guests. Bye for now.